Welcome everybody to Thursday Book Club. For anyone who's new tonight or anyone who's watching us online via YouTube, my name's Suzanne Leal and I'm the author of novels The Deceptions and The Teacher's Secret. I started Thursday Book Club during the 2020 COVID lockdown as a way of connecting readers online when really we couldn't connect in many other ways. 2 years on, we've continued to meet weekly on Zoom with a guest writer or two coming to join us once a month. For more information on Thursday Book Club and how you can join up or perhaps sign up to the newsletter, please just go to my website, which is simply my name, SuzanneLeal.com. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Tonight, I'm delighted to have two guests with me. Toby Roberts, who's the author of the memoir, Two Mums and a Dad, and Dina Davis, author of the novels Capriccio and A Dangerous Daughter. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
Hello, Dina. Hello, Toby. There are common threads between Dina's newest novel, A Dangerous Daughter, and Toby's memoir, Two Mums and a Dad. Both are coming-of-age stories, and both are deeply personal. Toby, for those who haven't yet read your memoir, tell me briefly what it's about, please.
Yeah, sure. So it's a story about my childhood growing up in Beecroft, which is for those who are not Sydney-siders, in the northern suburbs of Sydney, and quite a Christian and conservative area then and probably still now. And I grew up with a lesbian mum and a bunch of siblings. And so it's essentially a story about coming of age, as you said, Suzanne, growing up, but doing that when you're the odd one out in the street, in the neighbourhood, at school, and watching all of the different communities that we intersected with come to terms with my mum being, a lesbian in a world where that was, pretty scandalous. I'm sure there were some parts of Sydney and Australia where that wouldn't have raised an eyebrow, but in Beecroft it did. So it's supposed to be a bit of fun, actually. It sounds like a really earnest kind of exploration, but it's not at all. It was a really fun childhood we had, a very unconventional childhood, and plenty of opportunity to kind of experiment and be crazy, and the story hopefully captures all of that.
I think that's right. I'm just thinking back to Beecroft during that time because, of course, I lived very close by. I lived in Tennant Hills, which I came to late as a late teenager. And as you say, it was a pretty conservative spot. And I'm just wondering how you found Beecroft itself as a place for a child to live. I mean, there was a lot of nature. Was it a fun place, taking away your for that time unusual family situation? How was it as an area to grow up?
It was a really fun place, and a big chunk of the book is devoted to all of the expectations that I had about mums living lovers and how that would be received. All of those expectations were confounded, actually. So despite that very conservative atmosphere, everyone was incredibly welcoming. And they came to be huge supporters of mum and her partners. And it was, aside from being a surprisingly receptive community, it was also one where we had tons of freedom. There was the bush that you mentioned, which played a huge part in our childhoods, and I guess also just the atmosphere of the 70s, which was just a lot more permissive. And that whole thing of take off in the morning with your friends and come home at dinner time, which, I wish I could apply that same loose attitude to my parenting of my kids, but I'm just way too uptight. And I think the world is way more uptight now than it was then. So it was a life of freedom. I loved it.
Your mother seems to me to have been a particularly charismatic character, and perhaps still is. Tell me, if I were to have met her in 1985, what would I have seen? What would she have looked like?
Yeah, you're right. She was incredibly charismatic. She was very beautiful. She was a ballerina, a professional dancer for a time, and had lots of male and female admirers, and some very glamorous photos that I have in my collection at home from her in the 60s. But in the 70s, where this book starts to take off, it was that severe fringe that came in, and some pretty daggy clothes and enormous kind of Elton John sunnies. But even with that, she kind of she pulled it off because she had that sort of panache about her. But she was very magnetic personality, surprisingly quiet for that. So she was shy in her own way, but drew people to her because she was always looking to create fun. She was great at throwing parties. Always things were themed. Creativity was a huge part of the philosophy that she brought to raising children. She thought it was very important that we get to play dress ups and put on plays and play music. And she was eccentric. I guess to her detractors, she would have seemed odd, but there weren't that many detractors. She played the descant recorder, and then later in life picked up the shakuhachi, this obscure Japanese instrument. Multilingual, um, so yeah, spoke German and French and a smattering of Italian, and had taught those things to high schoolers, so was very good at that. And then later became a psychologist, so multiple degrees. Um, so a very accomplished woman, but wore that very lightly. And there wasn't a lot of sort of um, pomposity to the way she carried herself, and she was very welcoming of all types. Partly because she knew she was different and was very accepting of that difference in others. And in many ways was sort of diametrically opposed to my dad, who was probably none of those things I've just described, other than the fact that he too was very bright and academic.
Thank you. Thanks, Toby. Let's come to you, Dina. Why did you write A Dangerous Daughter as a fictional account when it's clearly, and I think you've said this elsewhere, very autobiographical?
Yes, I call it auto-fiction because it is a novel, it's not a memoir, and drawing on my own life for most of the book, but a lot of the things were made up. There are a lot of reasons for that. Well, the obvious one is that, I didn't want to distress my family because the years that I describe between about 1954 to 1959 were very distressing years. And that was a time similar to what Toby has just said, is actually the opposite of what Toby said. There was a lot more repression. It wasn't like the 70s. We didn't talk about certain things. And the family still doesn't want to talk about what happened to me as a teenager. So to protect them, and partly to protect myself, I decided I would write it as a novel. The other reason is that during the illness I had, I was given quite radical shock treatment. And as a result, a lot of my memories are wiped out. And so I actually didn't have the resources that maybe Toby has of clear memories of growing up. So I was forced to invent quite a lot. The key events are based on the truth, but a lot of the minor events, if you like, and of course the characters are invented.
And when you say the illness you had as a teenager, it didn't have a name when you were going through it, but it has a name now. Can you tell me what the illness was that you were suffering as a teenager?
Yes, it's now called anorexia nervosa, and I think most people know what that is. It's an illness where a person starves themselves, and often starves themselves to death. It has the highest mortality rate of any mental illness, and in the year that I became ill, there was absolutely no inkling that it was anything but simple personality disorder or refusal to eat because you wanted attention, something that was in the control of the person with the disease. And we now know that nothing could be further from the truth. It's been proved to be a genetically caused disease. And when it's in your DNA, there's very little you can do to control it. So in the year that I'm talking about, say in the mid-50s, there was no treatment. Nowadays, people are admitted to special units in hospitals for people with eating disorders. There was none of that. They didn't have the word eating disorder even. And they certainly didn't have the word for anorexia. So I was thought of as someone who was just playing up. And when it became clear that I was getting sicker and sicker and weaker, my parents resorted to the desperate measure of electroconvulsive therapy. I survived that, but it did nothing to cure the anorexia. And the fact that it had no name was quite significant in the way I was treated. As soon as 3 or so years into the disease, a doctor found an article in the Lancet magazine, that's a medical journal, describing a patient with exactly the same symptoms that I had. And this was coming from overseas, Europe or UK, and it was named anorexia nervosa. So it was a eureka moment for the doctor who was treating me. And from that time on, I was treated with far more respect. And it's just the power of a name is incredible.
And the power of knowledge, isn't it, as well?
And knowledge, yes.
Knowing what you're dealing with and how it can be dealt with. When
Absolutely.
I say that although your two works are very different, when I say there are some things that unite them, I think what it is the personal nature of the accounts. And first, to turn to you, Toby, this is a straight memoir. You've not fictionalized it. You've written about your family. You've written about their sexual lives. You've written about their conflicts. You've written about divorce. How did your family react to this book once it came out in the world and was published?
In none of the ways that I would have predicted, which is funny. You'd think I'd know them well and be able to predict it, but I just couldn't. My older brother, who came in for a ride, bollocking in the story, and mainly just because he was such a naughty kid, there was just no shortage of rich detail to draw on. I couldn't help it. But writing about his drug addictions and sexual misadventures and all this excruciating stuff, I thought that he would react really badly. But he called me up within a few days of me sending it over to him nervously for sign-off and said, "It's great, Tobes, you should have gone harder. You were self-censoring." So he was totally relaxed. My dad, who in many ways was depicted as the ogre of the story, was also pretty mild. He called up and said, "This is a clear-eyed memoir." I still don't even know what that means, but I think it sounds good. And more to the point, he only asked for one change, which was that the reference I'd made to the family dog being untrained. He said, "No, it's not true. You've got to fix that up," which was hilarious because one of the many allegations in the book was my dad was much more comfortable with dogs than he ever was with people. And he just bore that out entirely by saying, "You know what, all that stuff in the book about me being a drunk child beater, that's just fine. That dog, that's got to change." And I guess, and finally, my mum, who, conversely, I thought would be really rapt with the book because I think Lister meant it to be a very flattering portrayal of her, was quite hurt by aspects of the book and certainly sounded more hurt than the others that I'd engaged in the process. And she said, "You depicted me as a good time girl," which made it sound like I'd said she was a prostitute or something, which I certainly don't remember saying. But I think what she meant was that I had downplayed or trivialised her intellectual accomplishments in favour of all this prurient stuff about her private life, which, in retrospect was probably a fair criticism. So, yeah, incredibly varied reactions from all the family members and impossible to predict. I've given up doing it.
Dina, how about you? What reactions did you get from various parts of your family?
Well, interestingly, very little. I actually offered the manuscript to my sister to read because I did conflate my actual two sisters into one character to be sure that it would be nothing like either of them. And I said, look, I'd like you to read this. If there's anything you don't like, I'm happy to change it. And she refused to read it. She said, I know what that's about, and I don't want to read anything like that. It's too depressing. So I said, well, if there's anything you don't like later, it will be hard to change it. And I just, had to accept that she didn't want to and took a risk. She was the only one who was a bit negative. After the book was published, she said, yeah, it was good, but I didn't really like the way my parents were portrayed. And I said, well, actually, they are not your parents. I made them up. For example, our mother didn't speak German and wasn't a refugee. Our father wasn't sleazy like the character I invented. I made them as different as possible. And she said, oh, yes, but everyone will know and they'll think it's my parents. So she was very worried about repercussions to her. I informed the rest of my family about the book and said, I hope that nothing offends you. I got no response. However, my granddaughter and my niece wrote beautiful reviews, and that was wonderful. So, yeah, my granddaughter's studying psychology, so she was particularly interested. My niece is a rheumatologist. So she was very interested in the fact that people with a hidden disorder or an unnamed disorder suffer a lot of stigma, which she finds in her own practice. And she said it was one of the best accounts of how that feels to be blamed for something that's not your fault. So, I had varied responses, but mostly from complete strangers. Their responses were far more honest, and you can understand why, because, they had less personal investment in the story.
I also think, just in terms of members of the public, anorexia nervosa has become much more in the news. It's spoken about more often. I certainly know young women generally who have suffered from anorexia nervosa. And I think one of the interest points of your book is to see where we've come from your diagnosis, eventual diagnosis, and to discussion that happens today. Do you think these developments have been positive developments?
On the whole, yes. Well, just the fact that it's recognised as a disease and has a name, of course, that's a huge improvement. I'm not sure whether the treatment now, which sometimes is cognitive behaviour therapy, and often it's just focused on a feeding schedule, is always effective, not for everybody. My treatment was nothing like that. I was very, very fortunate to be able to have a course of psychoanalysis with a child analyst, a lay Freudian analyst who specialised in treating traumatised children who after the war, and just so happened to be in the place where I was. So it was sort of like fate. I think that's why I'm here today. So the treatment now, the big difference in the treatment now and when I went through the illness is that the family is very much involved. I think it's called family therapy, and the whole family is treated. The illness is part of every member of the family's psyche, so to speak. So they're treated as a group rather than one individual. I don't know that would have worked with my family when I look back. Some people have said you were very lucky not to have had family therapy. Others have said, well, you should have had family therapy, because I had the opposite, which was that my parents sent me across the continent as far away as you could get from where they lived on the eastern coast of Australia over to Perth in Western Australia. So we were like, 7,000 kilometres separated, and I didn't see my parents or my sisters for, in real life, it was 3.5 years. In the book, I made it a bit longer. So, yes, that would not happen today, because the family has to take some responsibility. And in the bad old days, the whole responsibility lay with the person with the illness. There was a lot of blaming and a lot of shaming. So I tried in the book to show how damaging that was, and to show how the opposite of compassion, kindness, and understanding was the way to healing, and I think still is. So whether you get that through family therapy, whether you get it through cognitive behaviour therapy, or as in my case, psychoanalysis, or talking it through with a psychologist, it's still very, very much improved, I suppose, because of our knowledge, as you say, because we now have the knowledge that it's a disease that is inherited through your genes.
Thanks. Dina, turning to you, Toby, it's clear from what you've said elsewhere that it was a difficult childhood and adolescence for you to navigate in many ways, given the conservative school you went to and the much less conservative family life and often disruptive family life you're experiencing. For all that, this is a really funny book, and it made me laugh out loud. And I'll just show the cover here. So it's a whimsical cover, two mums and a dad. It's brightly coloured, and it's funny. So my question to, just while we're here, this is, of course, Dina's book, A Dangerous Daughter. But turning again to you, Toby, what would you say the place of humour is, or what prompted you to write this book in such a for the most part, whimsical and lighthearted way?
Yeah, that's it's really interesting, just in light of what Dina was saying, because writing is a kind of therapy for me too, and humour definitely is a kind of therapy for me. That if I can take all my social failures and convert them into laughs, they lose their power over me. So if I go back into my childhood and rethink about all the things that were embarrassing or things that I stuffed up, and there was plenty of that, it used to just bring on a flush of shame that almost felt like it had happened 2 minutes ago, even though it was 40 years ago. And to be able to convert it into something where other people can get enjoyment out of it, meant my whole attitude to it shifted. Suddenly I just thought, this is fantastic. It's all material. And so I think now I wish I could say it really was just an adolescent thing, but I continue to make a dickhead of myself on a daily basis. So I've got this endless trove of material that I can work through. And I guess the other function that humour performs for me is almost editorial, in the sense that I go back through my life and deliberately try and select the things that are funny or weird. And if I'm enjoying the writing process of that, then I think I've got a better chance of bringing my reader with me. Or to put it another way, if I'm bored when I'm writing, then you can be pretty confident that readers are going to be bored when they're reading. So I guess in both those ways, I make it sound quite selfish, in the sense that it's all about me. and what I'm trying to get out of it. But hopefully the reader comes along with it. So it's very heartening to hear you say, Suzanne, that you found it funny, because that's definitely the intention.
And I'm curious when you say that sounds selfish. I mean, surely if the writer can't look to him or herself or themselves as to what they're doing, then when can you? When can you be in your own world? When can you be self-focused in a world where there's so much sparkling that demands your attention?
Yeah, exactly. And the only other thing I would say, when you mentioned, some of the heavier material, and my intention is always to write in a way that's light. Readers should be able to fly through what I've written. It should be light as a feather. I mean, ironically, you have to put a lot of work into it to make it come out light, but the intention should be just that it's an easy read. But that's not to say that it doesn't cover heavy material. It's just that should creep up on you unawares. So humour can be the way that you get the cat to eat the pill.
We're coming to the time where I'd like our audience to become involved as well if there are questions you have. And so have your questions ready, either pop them in the chat box, or else once I've finished the interview, you can unmute and perhaps raise a hand, and if you'd like to speak to the authors directly. But in the meantime, Dina, 3 book recommendations for Thursday book clubbers. We're avid readers and we'd love to know what you've been reading or what you could recommend to us.
Well, I think I've already given you heaps of recently. I think readers know what I've been reading recently, so I'm going to go back to the past. I loved the Russian writers when I was, a lot younger, and I still do. And I always go back to Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. So I love Anna Karenina, and that book's been a big influence on my life, and I've gone back to it every now and then just because I understand the character. I think for a man, Tolstoy was incredibly perceptive about women and their conflicts and their feelings. And so that's one. I could mention Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, which had a very profound effect on me as well. Recently, I love Helen Garner. She's probably my favourite Australian woman writer. And her third volume of her diaries, called How to End a Story, is an incredible work and very, very clever, because in tiny little snippets taken out of her journals over the years, she does tell a story that's quite, it's powerful, and it's a very unusual way to narrate. I don't know whether you'd call it her style memoir or autofiction, but it's different to anyone else. And of course, The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, because that echoes so much of my own experience growing up. And Sylvia Plath describes in a very light and sometimes humorous way many of the things that I experienced. So those are my 3 or 4. I think I said 4.
The more the merrier. Thank you so much, Dina. That really interesting choice. I appreciate that. Toby, what have you got for us?
Yeah, so these are all recent ones for me. Amor Towles, if that's the right way to pronounce his name, A Gentleman in Moscow, just finished and loved. Incredibly elegant and refined. Without wanting to give away too much, there's a character in it who comes to the hero for lessons on how to be a gentleman, and I felt like I was that guy, the unsophisticated man getting all of these fantastic lessons on the side. About a third of the way into Andrew Roberts's bio of Churchill, called Walking with Destiny. It's quite a big book and meticulously researched, but it doesn't feel heavy. I think it's because he's got such a terrific eye for colour in people's personal lives. It keeps it entertaining. And then finally, something that I always have by the bedside and dip in and out of, and his latest, for me at least, is David Sedaris's Let's Explore Diabetes with Owls. And, I think well, firstly, he writes in vignettes or what he calls essays, which lend themselves to chunked up reading, which is why you can dip in and out, which is fantastic. But I think he is the funniest writer alive today, just unbelievable. And when you come home from a bad day at work and want to stick your fork in the toaster, it just takes one of his little stories and everything's all right again.
I must say, I discovered David Sedaris years and years ago now, and I couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe how funny he was.
Oh, it was a real strike of lightning for me to think, you can do this. You can take all the embarrassing stuff in your life and dangle it out there for public ridicule.
Fantastic. So, final question before I hand over. What's next for you two, Toby? Writing-wise.
I've just in fact submitted to the publisher a story that stitches together all the reports I sent home from when I lived in Asia when my kids were just born. And it's a story about early parenthood and a lot of parenting fails from a dad's point of view. And whether it will see the light of day really is in the hands of the publisher now.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
Dina, what about you? What's next for you?
Well, I've just embarked on a sequel to A Dangerous Daughter because a lot of people have said to me, but I want to know what happens to the character's called Ivy, and he's a very different person to me. I have to point that out. But so again, I'll be drawing on my own life. And I'm hoping it'll have a bit more adventures and a bit more variety, perhaps, and less focus on the black side of life. So, so that's going to be a long, I take usually several years to get a book written. So who knows? I hope I live long enough to finish it. I'm very careful not to when I cross the road.
Nice then, and we'll look forward to the sequel. We've got a couple of minutes left for questions. So anyone would like to if you'd like to unmute now and let me know if you have a question. Otherwise, I've got 1,000 questions left to go. And here we go. I can see everybody coming on. Fantastic. Just I can see just yes, here. Greg, hello.
Hi. Wonderful to hear both you guys talk about your book. Terrific. And I don't want to hog it. I've actually got questions for both. But I'll just ask Dina a question first before rather than hog it by talking to both. But Dina, I love your choice of the Russians. Crime and Punishment's probably my favourite novel, and the book that and The Gambler. I love The Gambler. I don't know whether you read that, but it was a much shorter book and wonderful. And Crime and Punishment was probably the book that made me want to become a writer most. But I was going to ask if you'd ever seen Jane Campion's miniseries called An Angel at My Table, because it speaks about mental illness and shock therapy. It's about the New Zealand author Janet Frame, who suffered from schizophrenia, it might have been, or bipolar, I can't remember. But you've read that.
Oh, definitely, yes. I could have included that, but the movie is wonderful, the book's wonderful, and she's wonderful. And and in fact, for a long time, I took her description of her shock treatment as a model how to write about it. But, I wrote about it in my own way, but she is a fantastic writer, Janet Frame. God bless her.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Well, I have got one for Toby.
Please, Greg.
Dive in.
If nobody else has, I don't want to be hogging a show of Hazel.
Take the show.
All right. Toby, look, I loved hearing about that. I grew up in that area. I was at high school at Normanhurst Boys High and lived in Thornlea, as Suzanne knows, the other side of Pennant
Yeah.
Hills, and we had rich relatives living in Beecroft at the time.
Yes.
They were rich compared to us, that's all, but they were very conservative. I remember, this is in the late 60s and 70s, and I remember how, blue ribbon conservative Beecroft
Yes.
was. I mean, Thornlea was pretty conservative too, but it had
Yes.
pockets of resistance. But Beecroft was especially conservative. And so I wondered, as I loved hearing your tale about the people and the neighbours' reactions and so on, because I can remember growing up as a kid, there was one family we knew that was divorced even, and people spoke in hushed whispers about, oh, poor Natalie, she's divorced. So I can only imagine the shock of hearing that a little kid had lesbian parents. It must have been absolutely shocking for them at the time. But this, you were talking about the 70s, weren't you?
Yeah.
So things were starting to change then. I think probably post Gough Whitlam, things were a little bit more in the sexual revolution. People were probably a little bit more aware of, gay people living in their neighbourhood and so on. But yeah, I do remember how conservative the area was. So
it
hats
was,
off to you for surviving that.
I think what I remember changing in the 70s was just feminism. That the atmosphere was, the shift there was palpable.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it
I
was.
mean, homosexuality or lesbians, not so much, not in Beecroft, but I think within Sydney and Australia, absolutely. Yeah, and it was focused on the 70s was when my mum started sort of having living lovers and all the scandal that entailed. But it was not until the early 80s that we moved into a home with mum and her female partner. And it was still pretty scandalous in the 80s for Beecroft, when it would have been, totally mundane for, parts of the Blue Mountains or elsewhere, more arty communities up and down the coast. But yeah, I've got one section in particular that I used to kind of tease that out. It was very Christian neighbours watching mum and her new partner do the renovations, and mum's partner was really strong. She was this strapping woman, and she schlepped a couple of concrete bags up and down to do these renos, and they were just, their eyes were bugging out of their head, just thinking, they'd expected to get a standard nuclear family, and instead they got a pair of hot lesos, one of whom could squat the weight of a small car.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Toby. I'm mindful of the time. Just before we finish, Toby, can you give me a number between 1 and 20, please?
14.
14, okay. And that's my way of choosing the raffle winner. And the raffle winner tonight is Hazel.
Oh.
Hazel, congratulations. You are a winner. If you can send me an email with your address, and your will be in the mail. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending today. And thank you particularly to Dina Davis and Toby Roberts for their terrific insights and their company today. Fabulous books, and I highly recommend each of them. Thank you very much, and hopefully I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank
you. Bye, everybody. See you.
Fantastic.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Suzanne.